Welcome to the Essential Self-Care Podcast, a show for those of us who are, let's face it, too busy for self-care. Each week, we bring you real-life stories and expert insights to help you create a kinder, more compassionate relationship with yourself. I'm your host, Dr. Sheetal Ajmani, a physician with over 2 decades of experience blending Eastern and Western well-being practices. As the founder of Radiant Living Institute, I'm here to help you reconnect with your own inner radiance. Remember, small changes make a large impact, and it all starts here. Please note, this podcast is for educational purposes only and is not medical advice. Always consult your own healthcare provider about your specific situation. Now, let's get started. Welcome back to another episode of the Essential Self-Care Podcast. Now, I am so excited about today's guests. I can't even tell you. Julia and I met, virtually. It's been close to a year, and we met through the work that we're both doing around this movement, this initiative called social prescribing. And she is just such a beautiful soul. We've had we've been connected virtually and through email for close to a year now. And it's just always such a pleasure to be in communication with you. And I'm sure our listeners will just see this beautiful light that you are as well shining through this episode. But briefly, let me tell you a little bit more about Julia. Julia Hotz is a solutions-focused journalist based in New York. Her stories have appeared in the New York Times, Wired, Scientific American, the Boston Globe, Time, and more. She helps other journalists report on big, new, world-changing ideas at the Solutions Journalism Network. She is the author of The Connection Cure. If you're tuning in on YouTube, you can see I'm holding up the book right here. The Connection Cure, the prescriptive power of movement, nature, art, service, and belonging. This is the first book to explore the science, stories, and spread of social prescribing, which is a healthcare revolution to prescribe connections as medicine. I am so excited about this. This is a topic that I am passionate about, and I'm just so excited to dive in. Welcome to the show, Julia.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ajmani. That was such a sweet and warm introduction. And, the feeling is mutual when I read a bit about you and your work and the way that you've really been preaching the values of social prescribing for such a long time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's an idea, and we'll go into like what social prescribing is, of course, obviously. Because we're going to talk a little bit about your book today, about social prescribing, about what it is, about how people can start to use some of these concepts in their own life as part of their self-care as well. But, for me as a physician, since my first semester of medical school, I've had a really holistic view on health and well-being. And I knew that what I was learning in school is important. I think I've mentioned this on the show before. I knew that what I was learning in medical school was important. And I also knew that there was so much more additionally that contributes to our overall sense of well-being and living a full life. And in essence, that's what this movement, this initiative of social prescribing seeks to address. So I guess actually before we dive deeper into it, how would you describe social prescribing, Julia?
Absolutely. Well, I would describe it as, to your point, something that is really making good on the practice of holistic medicine, on the values of holistic medicine, by transitioning from asking what's the matter with the person to what matters to them. Really align with the principles of positive psychology as well. And what that means in practice is, yes, it's literally physicians, social workers, community health workers, nurses, all kinds of health professionals prescribing some non-medical community-based activity or resource that really helps that person achieve what matters to them. So practically it could mean prescribing an art class. It could mean prescribing. It could mean prescribing cycling lessons. It could even mean prescribing food and housing support and cash. And it comes from this idea that 80% of our health is socially determined by factors in our environment. In other words, only 20% of our health outcomes are driven by what happens in the doctor's office. Most of it is driven by the kind of environments we live in. And so social prescribing gets its name from that fact, addressing the social determinants of health.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. That was such a beautiful description. Exactly. And I was going to mention social determinants of health. And, the CDC has initiatives in place to address these social determinants of health, which the CDC recognizes that there are these social factors that that play a large role into our health and well-being. And all of this, I like to always emphasize as well that none of this is discrediting the importance of what goes on in the doctor's office. Like that is so
Yes.
important. And as a physician, I stand true behind that, right? That is so important. And what it is saying is that that is not the only thing, that in addition to that, addressing some of these social factors, these social determinants of health, um, can can and plays a large part in our overall healing journeys. And I love, and I know, you started your book in this way as well. This is a big part of your book as well. I love how you put it that we're shifting from what is the matter with you, right? To what matters to you. I love that shift so much. And so I want us to dive into that. But actually, before we get there, I'm curious, how did you get interested in this concept in the first place? Like, how did you discover this idea of social prescribing? What led you to write a book about it?
Absolutely. Well, to your points, I agree. This is not about throwing out other medicines. It's not about throwing away other therapies. This is meant to be an addition to the healthcare menu, another option on the healthcare menu. And I got interested in it not because I have much experience or expertise in healthcare. In fact, the book kind of starts from this place of, I feel pretty unqualified to write a book about health given some of my own habits and my lack of medical credentials. But as a journalist, as somebody who's been reporting on health and healthcare for the last, 8 years, I've noticed some trends. I've noticed that we're seeing increasing rates of psychological suffering, symptoms of anxiety, depression, ADHD. We're also seeing increasing rates of loneliness, right? This was actually how this whole journey began. Is I was a grad student in the UK who needed a thesis topic. I was studying sociology, and I'd seen this press release that the UK government was establishing a minister of loneliness. And I thought that's really interesting. We're investing government resources into loneliness. Like this feels a bit strange, and that's what led to all this research that led me to discover how profoundly loneliness impacts our health. A statistic that the US Surgeon General throws around a lot, derived from research from Dr. Julia Hotz, is that the health consequences of this are equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And so, from the UK's perspective, this was really about public health. And this is a country that has a nationalized healthcare system because people are so lonely there. Because I would come to find out 1 in 5 doctor's appointments are made for social reasons. There's actually an urgent political reason to invest in solutions to loneliness. So, long story short, I started asking people who identified as lonely, what would you like the government to do? That's when I first learned about social prescribing, the idea of investing in community activities the same way we'd invest in research and development of, pharmaceuticals. And it led me to discover that social prescribing, it's not just about addressing loneliness. It's about addressing depression, anxiety, ADHD, chronic pain, type 2 diabetes, all of these afflictions under the sun.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I love that. And, you're right. We are in this, your interest in it started with uh, to some degree with it, how it's affecting loneliness. And, we are facing this epidemic of loneliness in our country. We're facing mental health crisis in our country, we're also facing, shortages in the healthcare system as well due to multiple reasons, partially being the rising rates of burnout among healthcare professionals, right? And so that's leading to staffing shortages and a strain on the healthcare system. And so what I love about this whole model that we're talking about here is it really addresses all of that. It addresses the health and well-being of individuals and communities. It addresses the strain on the healthcare system, right? It addresses these really major issues that are impacting the health and well-being of communities, including loneliness and mental health, as well as others. And so when you took to writing your book, and I have had the opportunity to read the book and I highly recommend it, you had specifically addressed these social prescriptions and looked at them relating to 5 specific areas. And those areas were movement, nature, art, service, and belonging. Can you talk a little bit about that and like why those 5 areas?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I'm happy to talk about some of the research around that, but it really came from people like you, people who have been sort of integrating the modalities of Eastern and Western medicine into their practice for a long time. People who have been practicing integrative medicine, lifestyle medicine, positive psychology, all names for kind of a similar idea, which is that our health is very much impacted by our environment, and prescribing things that help people have a more positive environment benefits their health. So, this is a way for people like you to actually do that.
Before we go on, I'm excited to share something that could really make a positive impact on your life. Do you feel like you've lost touch with your true self? Reclaim Your Radiance is Radiant Living Institute's signature coaching program designed to help you reclaim your worth, renew your energy, and restore your happiness in your life, career, and relationships. This 6-module program has already helped countless women regain control of their lives. Whether by setting boundaries in challenging relationships, finding strength through life transitions like divorce, pivoting in their careers, or rediscovering their purpose as they embrace new chapters of their life. Start your journey today and begin living authentically, unapologetically, and radiantly once again. Head over to radiantlivinginstitute.com/reclaim-your-radiance to get started. I hope you found that helpful, and if you're ready to explore this more, check out the link in the show notes. Now, let's jump back into today's episode.
And I chose to focus on these 5, number one, because it's what kept coming up when I was investigating different social prescription models around the world. You know, by the way, this is spread to 30 different countries now. Movement, nature, art, service, belonging. These were sort of common denominators. But I also chose them because they had, again, even before this concept of social prescribing came along, there exists a ton of research preceding this showing that art, for example, is really good for helping people cope with symptoms of an anxiety disorder or post-traumatic stress disorder. This is why the discipline of art therapy has been around for almost 100 years. There's something about the way engaging with the arts, immersing ourselves in another story, helps us sort of reframe and seek perspective on our own. And so this book is about saying, okay, let's take all that research and let's see what happens when, in that chapter, for example, a man named Jonas, who has severe agoraphobia and social anxiety, is prescribed culture vitamins, is prescribed opportunities to sing with a choir and join a book club at the library and go to the museum and go to local concerts. So it was about picking these 5 really as they respond to some of the biggest afflictions we're seeing in physical and mental health. Another big one is movement for depression, right? There's a ton of data suggesting that moving our bodies helps us release endorphins. It can help stimulate our production of serotonin. Some of the same things that our pharmaceutical interventions do can be done with movement. And so that chapter takes us to a person named Amanda who had been struggling with severe depression after all these terrible things happened to her, is prescribed the maximum dose of an SSRI, an antidepressant, And by the end of it is able to not fully come off that antidepressant, which isn't really the goal anyway, but is able to significantly reduce her dosage and find that sea swimming, that was her social prescription, helps her increase her energy, helps her make friendships, helps her find a reason to wake up in the morning on her own. Nature, really good for attention disorders. It turns out that there's something about the way we evolved that makes us interact with nature in a way that's actually really restorative for our attention. It's almost like everything else in the world sucks our attention, but nature has this unique capacity to both fascinate us and restore it. And that's why it's been prescribed for kids with ADHD or people with addiction or stress, things that sort of compound your attention. And so I could go on, but that was the rationale behind choosing those five. And then also in the last section of the chapter, and I think this really relates to essential self care, these five things are accessible. They're often free. We often have a world of opportunity in our communities to actually make movement, nature, art, service, and belonging more part of how we live our lives. And so this is about giving readers the science and some ideas to do that.
Yeah, yeah, I love that. And you're so right, you know, and there is so much science and research behind all of these modalities, right? A few months ago, I had another physician on this show who is, you know, her focus is nature as medicine. And so she's also
Mm.
known as Dr. Outdoors. So she talked a lot about the science behind nature and how that can be so helpful, you know, with different conditions and for our overall health and well-being as well. And so for all of these modalities, as you mentioned, movement, art, I just read a study, an interesting study about music therapy, you know, because we've been talking a lot about like mental health and also mentioning though that there's research behind these modalities helping with other sort of health issues. And I just read an article about music therapy. There was this, it was a small study, but it was about music therapy as an intervention in addition to conventional treatments for head and neck cancer patients who have swallowing difficulties. And so
Mm.
one group had received only the conventional therapies. The other group received the conventional therapies plus a therapeutic singing intervention guided
Wow.
by music therapists.
That's
And they
great.
demonstrated a more significant improvement in their swallowing function at the completion of that study, right? And so it's really interesting. There is information out there about how these modalities, yes, address, you know, mental health issues, which is, and loneliness, which are both such big epidemics currently, and also how they can affect other clinical outcomes as well, which is also really, really fascinating. And,
Mm.
you know, as you were describing this, you led us to the final section of your book, which was, I found the whole book to be incredible. But yes, particularly given my specific interests and essential self care, I loved that last portion because that's where you, as a journalist, as the author, as a human being, you know, recapped like, okay, I went on this journey of exploring and researching and traveling around the world, meeting people who are engaging in these social prescriptions. And then in that last section, you really took a look at all of that and said, wait a second, how can I actually apply this to my own life? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that research, by the way. That's so interesting about the music therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Music is a big social prescription for me, by the way. And exactly, that's sort of the idea behind the last section is saying, okay, you know, not all of us may have the full blown DSM criteria of depression or chronic pain or anxiety or ADHD or even loneliness for that matter. Loneliness, you know, there are lots of clinical scales you can use to measure this. But all of us, evidenced by the fact that all of these afflictions are increasing, you know, they haven't gone down over time. Lifestyle and mental illness has only gone up. That tells us something about the way we're living, right? And it tells us that all of us may experience some symptoms of these things sometimes. And I want to be really clear with this because I don't mean to say that feeling sad every now and then is equivalent to major depression disorder or that experiencing a little social anxiety is equivalent to agoraphobia. It's just actually almost to destigmatize the way that all of us may not be able to have the intensity of it, but can relate to it on some level. And so for me, after, I get those caveats out of the way, I started to look at my own life and started to look at the ways, how am I not feeling healthy? How could I feel healthier? Wellness, I think, sometimes gets caught up in the sort of wellness industry of, we need products and we need these 10-step hacks and we need these, even mindset interventions and journaling and these specific, like, kind of product driven things we could do. But I wanted to write that section to say that's not all there is. You can also use the medicine that's in your community when you have some of these symptoms of unwellness, let's say. So for me, one example I use is having a hard time getting over a breakup, really feeling sad, really wanting to lay in bed all day, not having motivation to leave, and feeling really stuck. And then I thought about Amanda, who I referenced earlier, who went through that sea swimming prescription for her depression. And I said, what can I do that's kind of like that? Maybe I will have sort of a wellness epiphany the same way that she did. And so I prescribed myself this early morning running group, which, kind of like Amanda's sea swimming, is, outside, it's physical activity. It's kind of hard. You don't really want to do it when you wake up, but then after you do it, after you've had those endorphins pump through your system, after you've done it, especially with other people, you feel this sort of energy boost and buzzy aliveness, and kind of the opposite of stuck. So that's one example. And the part 3 really goes through other examples of how I've coped with feeling really distracted and burnt out and overwhelmed, something I'm sure your listeners can relate to, or feeling, like I'm really worried about something that's out of my control, like my parents getting older, or, the passing of time, these sort of things that, like, keep me up at night at 3 a.m. It turns out art is a really good way to cope with those sorts of things. Distraction, as we said, nature is so helpful. A surprising one for me was that, those are sort of like psychological ailments. But while I was writing this book, I had been struggling with a series of migraines and headaches. And, all of these health ailments are complicated. There's not one cause and there's not one solution. But when I was struggling with it, I was going to all these headache specialists and trying to understand, like, what can I do? What can I take? Is there something inside my brain? What's going on? And then it was only through surveying the research on the way repressed anger and tension and stress that has nowhere to go can really compound physical symptoms. Sometimes it can lead to chronic pain, like it does for one person in my book. But for me, it was manifesting as these headaches. And it turns out volunteer service, a way to kind of like get outside yourself, is a great coping mechanism for this. So I prescribed myself an afternoon volunteering at this community garden. So yeah, you got to read the book and check out the website socialprescribing.co to look up some of these scientific studies and ideas for things you can prescribe yourself. But that's the main idea.
Yeah, I love that. Oh my goodness. And I knew we were going to hop on here and we could just like keep going about this because this is so incredible. I will include those links, the link to your book, socialprescribing.co, in the show notes as well. So definitely I encourage anyone listening to take a peek at that. I alluded to a bit earlier that we met through, the work that we're both doing around social prescribing. You obviously through the research that you've done and writing the book. Just a quick shout out. Many of my listeners may or may not know that I wear many hats. And so in addition to being the founder of Radiant Living Institute, also the host of this show, I also serve as the medical advisor for a nonprofit organization in Hampton Roads, Virginia called the Benjamin Goldberg Foundation. which is really focused on transforming the healthcare experience through the healing arts, which naturally led us to this concept of social prescribing. So we are working on finding ways to bring that to our region. There is not yet, a unified program in the United States, but there are pilot programs starting up in different regions within the United States. And then also, my hope is for anyone listening that now empowered with this knowledge, that you begin to, on an individual level, begin to integrate some of these tools and modalities within your own life and or the lives of your loved ones as well. So Julia, this has been so incredible. Like I mentioned, I will include links in the show notes below, but can you just say one more time where people can learn more about you, your book, the work that you're doing?
Thank you so much, Dr. Ajmani. I'm so honored to be working with you, with Benjamin Goldberg, and with all of our continuing social prescribing work. And the best way to find me is to find me on socials at Hotz Thoughts. My personal website also, hotzthoughts.com, my last name, and then thoughts. And also, if you want some resources that have come out of the book, check out www.socialprescribing.co.
Wonderful. And all of those links are in the show notes. Thanks again for being here, Julia.
Thank you so much.
I know you have so many choices for how to spend your time, so I thank you for being here today with Essential Self-Care. As a gift, download your free workbook, 6 simple yet powerful steps to create your radiant life at radiantlivinginstitute.com and start your journey to a more radiant you.